Welcome to our first think tank for the year. This is a very important event for us. We have a very distinguished speaker, but I'm quickly going to hand you over to our director of the business school, Dr. Joseph Sekhampu, who will welcome you, and then we'll take it from there.
Thank you, Albert, and welcome to everyone. This is one of the many sessions that we call the think tanks. And through the think tanks, we hope to bring experts and external stakeholders to really discuss issues that face our country and the global world, and to see how we can best chart the way forward. And today's session is particularly special as we have the honor of hosting our former Minister of Finance, Mr. Trevor Manuel, to share his insights and wisdom with us. So as we gather today, we also recognize the importance of reflecting on where our country has come from and where we're headed. I think many people appreciate the impact that the COVID pandemic has had on our country, and really the need for us to think creatively about the future. And Mr. Manuel has got a distinguished career in public service, and his vast experience in economic policy will hopefully he will share his expertise and makes him an ideal speaker for today's session. So again, welcome, and please spread the word and join our webinar series as we go along.
Joseph, thank you very much. Yeah, so just for the benefit of, let's say, another generation, we would like just to give Prof Raymond Parsons a minute or two to explain and say who this speaker is and why we think that it is important to listen to his insights. Prof Raymond?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think that the best way for me to start is to hold up this book, which I think Mr. Manuel may remember, and see as a sort of track record of his role as the Minister of Finance over many years. Manual Markets and Money, Essays in Appraisal, and a foreword by our former President Nelson Mandela, which sought at the time to outline the years that Trevor Manuel spent as a very distinguished and important Minister of Finance. We evaluated him over time, and I think there's no doubt that he ranks as among the best of the ministers of finance that we've had in South Africa, and certainly since 1994. And I think the fact that we've got such a good participation today is also a tribute to his standing and his profile, and the wisdom and the judgment that he's brought, not only when he was Minister of Finance, but also when he moved to the private sector. And I think that his understanding of both the dynamics of the public sector and the private sector are really what distinguishes him as a person of high profile and of great authority on our economy, on economic policy, on what our hopes and fears are for the future. So, Mr. Manuel, I think we are very privileged to have you on our platform today, and I would like to invite you to please share your thoughts with us about the South African economy.
Thank you very much, Prof Parsons. Thank you, Prof Sekhampu. Thank you to all of you for attending. Thanks for the invitation from NWU. The topic, where we come from and where we need to get to, has been framed. So it's not a topic I chose, but I think it's an interesting topic for a whole host of reasons. And it compels me to take a view of the economy that's longitudinal. And I want to take that view that would include, I think, three important inflections along the line. I also want to take a view that is economics as the old order interdisciplinary view, which is more of a social science and hard statistics. I'm not afraid of statistics, but I think for the purposes of this discussion, perhaps the social science, economics as a social science is a bit more useful. So But if we want to come back to the stats in discussion, it's very important. I think the longitudinal view is also important because what tends to happen is that the world is driven by snapshots. And the more social media is prominent, the more the tendency to snapshots. One of the reports this morning is that a bank that tanked in Silicon Valley a few weeks ago, Silicon Valley Bank, lost $42 billion of deposits in a single day, driven primarily by social media. This is the speed of social media. And if you look back in the history, economic history, you will find that the events of the 30s, when the banks collapsed, leading to the Great Depression, there were long queues of people trying to get their money out. And there's also this issue in Lebanon as we speak. But it's social media that drives issues in a way. And social media doesn't lend itself to discerning approaches, especially to issues of policy. Two other bits of information that's important today. I'm saying factor it into the way in which we analyze issues going forward. The first of these is that the IMF had a staff team out here, and they did a tentative report just yesterday, and they've downgraded South Africa's growth prospects to 0.1%. Now that's a very significant downgrade from what the Minister of Finance announced in the budget speech on the 22nd of February, where we were at 0.9%. And the very important warning from the IMF is that we risk stagnation in South Africa. That's the one side of the warning. The other side comes from a release yesterday by Stats SA, which is the latest CPI, the inflation rate, which tops 7%. And with that, the very important warning that suggests that the Reserve Bank may, at their Monetary Policy Committee meeting next week, be compelled to raise interest rates once again. Now, stagnation and inflation is perhaps brought together, is perhaps one of the greatest fears that economists have everywhere. It's been bunged together and it's called stagflation because it always leads to the hardest policy choices because inevitably it comes with increased unemployment. So those are the circumstances it faces now. That's a snapshot of the present, but it doesn't answer where we come from. And I think that where we come from is fundamentally important because South Africa in the 1950s and 60s grew at a reasonable clip of 5.1%. There was a period when South Africa was the world's largest gold producer, when the Free State gold fields were opened, when there was investment pouring in, when there were large conglomerates sitting over the economy. And the two big employers were actually agriculture and mining. Interestingly, both of these sectors lent themselves to low wages and migrant labor, both of them integrally part of the apartheid system. And in the 70s, you saw sanctions start to kick in, disinvestment and divestment started, and there was a very rapid change. And you know, by the 1980s, that growth trajectory had changed very radically, and in fact, ahead of democracy from about 1989, we were in a long period of recession. Now, this period, from about then, is the first inflection. It's the point. It's a period of negotiations that gave rise to our new constitution. I think it's a period rather than a point. Nobody's quite sure when it started. You could say that it may have started on the 2nd of February 1990, when political parties were unbanned, when political activity was freed up. But it certainly wasn't. It didn't all happen on the 27th of April 1994. But the period intensively brought with it substantial new hope as the negotiations took root and a new government was elected for the first time democratically by all South Africans. The first order of that government was to craft a new constitution. And that constitution is important because it creates a set of durable commitments about all manner of issues, not just human rights, but also about the economy. And in the preamble to the constitution, it says that, amongst other things, we must lay the foundations for a democratic and open society in which government is based on the will of the people and every citizen is equally protected by law. But perhaps more importantly, for the purposes of this discussion, improve the quality of life of all citizens and free the potential of each person. Now, the second part of that commitment, free the potential of each person, is actually a very direct commitment to education that changes what had happened in the past, because we know that apartheid education, Bantu education, if you must, snuffed out the potential of too many South Africans. So these commitments are now embodied in our constitution, and they bring with them a period of hope. The key issue is, if you want to deliver on that hope, it's fundamentally important that there be metrics by which you can measure the improvement in the quality of life, because it is a continuous process, and you must be able to ensure that these commitments are met. I mean, we can debate in the side channel whether some of the events going on in the Pietermaritzburg High Court at the moment suggest that all are equal before the law, as the Constitution suggests. But those are the debates that we must lend ourselves to in a healthy democracy. I'm saying it's not a date, it's an event, because Parliament adopted the Constitution on the 8th of May 1996. So it was a kind of two-year process during which we participated as members of the Constitutional Assembly. And the Constitutional Court only signed off on the Constitution in December of 1996. So the first 2 years was a process of constitution making, but to ensure that it wasn't just constitution making, other things needed to happen. And so in those heady days, on the 14th of June 1996, and I'm sure it's referenced in Prof Parsons' book, we placed before Parliament a process of tightening macroeconomic policy, which we called GEAR, Policy for Growth, Employment and Redistribution, which saw us tightening the deficit and taking more control of what was happening in the fiscus. And so, you know, these things happened together. The political scientists would take a long track and debate the political fallout from those decisions, but I think it's quite important to look at them in the context of establishing political decisions and aligning economic policy with the Constitution. I'm saying that some of our friends and comrades clearly did not like that process. It was a matter settled not far from where you are in Mahikeng in December of 1997, but we can talk more about that. Those decisions in GEAR resulted in a gradual pickup. So if you looked at the longer period, and this is one of the joys of economics, you can choose the period that you want to measure to get the results you want to measure. But if you looked at the longer period from 1994 to 2008, the average growth rate was 3.8% per annum. And you've got to compare that with 1.4% between 1980 and 1993. Or if you looked at the tighter period from 2004 to 2008, when those decisions of 1996 were working through the economy much better, the average growth rate was 4.8% per annum. But it wasn't just growth, it's also manifested in the period that there was a period of very significant job creation between 2000 and 2008. Of course, all of it was assisted by a commodity super cycle, but if you didn't have institutional mechanisms, including a revenue service that had been retooled, if you didn't allocate resources differently, and included in the reallocation of resources, we introduced child support grant and a range of other measures. So it wasn't just a fiscal tightening, it wasn't imposing hardship on the people. It was actually a process of integral change. But I'm saying that's the first period, and I'm saying that inflection, the second inflection that we need to take account of, begins in about 2007 with a conference of the African National Conference at Polokwane. Part of the resolutions of that conference sought to change the teams that were responsible, and indeed, in September of 2008, President Mbeki was removed from office. That happened to coincide with the collapse of Lehman Brothers and the start of the Great Recession globally. So it was an interesting period. I'm saying if you want to understand economic policy, understand the inflection, you had a team that had done reasonably well. You chose to remove that team. You chose to remove that team at a time that was exceedingly adverse. Jobs were lost. The economies across the world tanked, and you didn't have the wherewithal to provide the lift. And so, understanding that period of 2007 to 2009 is actually important, because also what happened was the dismantling of a series of institutions. Come back to that in a moment. The institutional damage was done largely in government departments. The very rapid change of personnel at provinces and later at local government resulted in damage across all three spheres of government. And therefore, the ability to hold together and implement policy continuity or even policy change in a cohesive way was very severely constrained. And that was the first period. And I think that what you will find during that period as well, 2009 is the start of the Zuma era, that some of the institutions, especially the institutions in the criminal justice cluster, were very badly damaged. And so it appeared as though there was a free-for-all. So you didn't have policy capacity because key parts of government had been taken apart. You didn't have consequence management because the criminal justice cluster was impacted upon. And but the real damage actually comes after the 2014 elections. And if you read the 6 volumes of the Zondo Commission report, it deals primarily with that period. It's a very short period. It's a blip in history. It's like 4 years that did untold damage. But Zondo is still very present in our minds, and we can play these things out, all of us, probably all 500 of us on this call. We can play out various aspects of what went down in Zondo, but we need to remind ourselves that all of it happened in a very short period in history. And if you look at it in world history, it's not even a blip, but it was exceedingly damaging for all manner of reasons. One of the other things that happened in that period was a national planning commission was put together. I chaired the planning commission. We didn't quite have a mandate. We considered what we needed to do, and we went back to the Constitution, especially the preamble that I referred to earlier, and asked how we could reinvigorate these values because they are ours as South Africans. And we produced this 486-page report, and there are a number of key recommendations that have not been advanced upon. And let me just lift out two that have been very topical in the recent past. The one is chapter 5 deals with environmental considerations. And if you read that chapter and you read the recommendations on the just transition from coal, when we had a bit more time to consider these matters, they haven't actually been taken seriously. Or you could look at chapter 13, which deals with the recommendations for a capable and developmental state. There are bits there that were picked up again by Zondo in his final report that deal with a particular issue that is unresolved in my mind, that is key to resolving how you grow the economy, and that relates to the political administrative interface. In other words, ministers must do what ministers do, and DGs as heads of department must do what they do. Ministers are designed to be itinerant, so the Minister of Police might be the Minister of Finance next, but DGs are meant to be more permanent because they have a different skill set. But these issues are actually core to how you need to construct and administer government, and then also in that chapter, the intergovernmental relations, which give life to chapter 3 of our Constitution, which is about cooperative governance. Sadly, that advice in the National Development Plan has tended to be largely ignored. So that's a period between the first and the second inflection. The third inflection is actually 2018, when Jacob Zuma was removed a few months, well, maybe 15 months early, replaced by Cyril Ramaphosa at the behest of the ANC, the call for Tumamina, and the promise of a better tomorrow. So that's the third period, and I think that to a greater or less extent, we still are in that period because we haven't had a major inflection since. Now, that period will bring us into the present, but one of the issues that happens in the period 2020 to 2022 is COVID, which is interesting for a whole host of reasons in the context of economic policy. One of them is that when government needed support, it was the private sector that stepped up to the plate, created the Solidarity Fund, collected resources. Nowhere else in the world was this done, and availed its resources and skills to the people of South Africa. Its intentions lived on through Business for South Africa, and Business for South Africa, amongst other things, was tasked with the responsibility of developing an economic recovery strategy at ERS, which they produced in July of 2020 with massive input from across the private sector. That was taken to NEDLAC for discussions, and out of that came an economic recovery and action plan in September of that year, and later government called it the Economic Reconstruction Recovery Plan. In my view, slightly watered down from where we could have been. But with all of that information on the table, the key issue is whether the advice is being taken, whether it is being internalized, and whether implementation is happening at the pace that ought to happen. Brings us back to where the IMF report was yesterday, that it says, unless there is measurable economic reform, stagnation is obviously going to take place in South Africa. So where does that leave us at the moment? I think the first issue is that we're looking at a situation where the opportunities and the prognosis suggests fairly constrained environment. The prognosis is for low growth, low employment, and steady state vulnerability And then, of course, you've got to factor in higher vulnerability to global debt, and then global politics. Geopolitics, I think, is something that you've got to factor into the growth cycle. And the other big issue that we need to talk about, because it is clearly missing, is the ability of government to provide coordination and leadership to all of society. Not just the tripartite alliance, but to all of society. That's why government's elected. That's why, regardless of which country you're in, what heads of state tend to say, at the time of the election, I will serve all the people of this country, regardless of whether they voted for me or not. So the question, at a time like this, when people need hope, when they need practical proposals for going forward, where will that all of society governance come from? I think that if we understand the manifestations of each, the first and most important challenge for us is unemployment. And here it's very evident in the age distribution. 15 to 24-year-olds, 59.6% of them are unemployed. And 45 to 54, 20.5%. In reality, the matric pass rate is 48%. The bachelor's pass, 23%. And the matric pass rate with mathematics, with those scoring more than 50% in mathematics, is 5%. Now, this is fundamentally important. If you want to change from a low-wage economy to a higher-level economy, then I think we understand that the STEM subjects are going to be fundamentally important. And what happens in schooling is quite important. And one of the questions that has to be on the table is the extent we've moved from the way in which education was provided or doled out under apartheid to where we are now. Because I think the shadow of apartheid is still very evident in, amongst other things, the maths and science pass rate. And unless we deal with that, labor market participation is going to be a major problem in the future. That means constrained markets. That means lower levels of income. And it's also important to recognize that our education spending in this current fiscal year is 298 billion rand. It's unlikely to be able to grow any higher. So how do you fix the problem? But fix the problem you must if you want better education outcomes. There are a few topics that have become very evident for a whole host of reasons. Amongst these is that business leaders have actually, this is a season when so many businesses are reporting on results for the 2022 year. It takes a quarter to work through audits and so on, and this is the period when results are being published. And so many business leaders have raised a number of key issues that they raise as constraints to company growth, and if you aggregate these then to national economic growth. The first of these is the energy crisis. There was a joke before we started about what time load shedding will happen. It isn't a joke. The second issue is the state of Transnet. If we cannot export and import, and if our ports don't work, and if our agricultural produce will rot in our ports because of power outages, then we will be isolated and poor. The third issue is general infrastructure. I'm told that, amongst other things, Raymond, the Northwest is the pothole capital of the whole wide world. Infrastructure is a major problem, but you've got to add the ability to provide logistics, and very, very importantly, the state of water. The UN released a water report earlier this week, and we've got so many own goals in respect of water in this country. Again, the National Development Plan dealt at some length with the water scarcity in South Africa and how we might deal with harvesting and reticulation, and very little of this has happened. The next issue raised by business leaders, again, doesn't have to be business leaders, everybody's concerned about it, is crime and corruption. you look at some of these very horrific cases. I mean, and you think of Senzo Mahiwa, and they haven't even found his killers when there were 9 people in a house. We've seen the footage of the shooting of AKA the other day. They haven't arrested anybody. And so you can go on. The father and son, Smith it is Smith, isn't it? Were assassinated in Midrand in broad daylight on Saturday. No arrests. Unless these issues are dealt with, I think South Africans feel less good about the opportunities for economic growth. And economic growth itself, I think that we're concerned, and I'm saying the IMF had voiced this, and then state capacity at all 3 spheres of government. Reports about Department of Mineral Resource and Energy that haven't had a cadastre. We haven't been able to invest in mining because exploration is down, because we don't have the geological maps, because for whatever reason, or local government and its failures, and it's incapable of collecting the revenues to repair what it has to, and so we all live in our houses fearful of going out at night and so on. That's no way to live. But state capacity is clearly very deeply concerning. Penultimate point I want to make is that I don't want to, in spite of what I've just said, I don't want to sound like a harbinger of doom. There are some lights, and I think that the change of plan and the ability to bring in the private sector into energy generation last year was very important. It will be taken forward, and the agreement on the feed-in tariffs for renewables will also take the energy arrangement very, very far forward. The emphasis that government now has on the cost of doing business is going to be important. The president raised it in the SONA. The National Water Resources Infrastructure Plan, I think, will place us in good stead if it's delivered upon, and then agreements on the visa system. But I think it's also painfully slow. Let me conclude by 8 points to watch out for, and I think these 8 points will all have a profound impact on economic growth over the next period. The first of these is the impact of the grey listing by the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF as it's called. The second is the credit rating outlook by the rating agencies. We may not like them. It's a terrible situation. We have to pay them for the ratings, and they rate us in the way that they do. But it does mean that our ability to attract capital is severely constrained by the sub-investment grade rating that we have from all of them. The third issue, fundamentally important for growth, is the general performance of the state-owned enterprises, or state-owned corporations, if you must. The fourth issue is corruption and the prosecution of perpetrators. And I want to put into that very important subset of the protection of whistleblowers. The fifth issue is protests and civil unrest. Sometimes they don't go according to the plans of the conveners. I shan't mention days or organizers. The sixth issue is the prognosis for the ANC's electoral support in the elections next year. It's the first time it's become an issue since 1994, and becomes an issue for the next point, and that is coalition politics. Important question of whether the country is ready for coalitions. I mean, I'm speaking to you from Johannesburg, where we have a mayor from one of the smallest parties. Nobody knows him, nobody knows his party, and there's a debate up the road from us in Tshwane about who will be the mayor, whether it's a party with a single seat or 2 seats in the municipality. But that is no way to conduct coalition politics. The electorate is completely excluded, and that is anti-democratic. And then finally, and I come back to the point that the IMF raises when they draw attention to the stagnation and our 0.1% outlook, economic growth and policy reforms. They must be seen and must be seen to be done. So let me thank you there and invite conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Indeed, very insightful and something that we have to listen to. I'm now going to invite my colleagues to ask questions to Mr. Manuel. Prof Raymond, can I start with you?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Manuel. I think that was a very comprehensive and a very perceptive and balanced assessment of the positive and the negative factors which will shape the way ahead for the South African economy. I would like to ask a two-part question, if I may. The first is a more general one, and going back to the book and our subsequent experience of you as the Minister of Finance in the last couple of years, that the legacy was that you left the country with a big surplus on the budget. I won't go into the numbers, but I think that the debt to the GDP was something around about 25%, something like that. A year or two ago, with the previous Minister of Finance, he was deeply concerned about what he called the jaws of the hippo, as far as government spending was concerned, and his concerns around the issue of a debt crisis. And then, of course, our current Minister of Finance did a very credible job in his recent budget, but he's battling to keep the debt ratios within credible limits nonetheless. So I wondered what you thought were some of the institutional or structural aspects which led us from where we were with you originally and where we are now in terms of the fiscal outlook. And the subpart is one of the recurring themes as far as the fiscus is concerned, is how do they deal with the public sector wage bill? It keeps recurring. It's again an issue now. And I wondered whether you would share with us your thoughts. Are there any guidelines that one could evolve to say this could be better handled, and that there are some norms that perhaps ought to be followed, which would make this less than a destabilizing threat to the fiscal targets? So I thought that's my sort of two-part question, which I'd like to put to you.
Thanks. Would you like me to respond to these now, or would you like me to receive all of them? I'm entirely in your hands.
Yes, please do so. It will be wonderful if you can respond now.
Okay, thanks. Look, Prof Parsons, the surplus is actually an interesting blip. Someday, perhaps somebody will write of the intensity. It may have been one of the most intense debates in the cabinet room during that era, because there's a notion that surpluses are not for developing countries. But in retrospect, the surplus provided us with a bit of a cushion when the bad times hit. And in the Treasury, we debated this, and I think we took reasonable global advice. And if you went back to the budget speech of 2007, I think 2008, it started in a very funny way. It started with the words, "Madam Speaker, if I were the weatherman." And it spoke of impending storms. And I don't think many in South Africa were ready to listen. So that was the first problem. The second problem is that there's a very strange phenomenon in this, and in fact in some other countries, where it's deemed to be very left to have high deficits. Now, I wouldn't go into a township and suggest to people that if they want to be very militant, they must go off to the money lenders, the mashonisa, and borrow extensively. Because inevitably, you walk into the situation of interest costs being the largest issue. And I just want to reflect back on that heady period, because I had a discussion with President Mandela in when I became Minister of Finance in '96. When I kind of got my feet on the desk, and he said, "Trevor, what keeps you awake at night?" And I said, "Mr. President, it's the fact that if we continue along this path, then by 1998, the largest budget item will be debt service costs." And he said in his very typical way, "I'm not an economist, but let me understand that money spent, and we're now paying interest on the money that was spent. And we're paying more interest on money that's already been spent than what we were spending on education," which I had to confirm. And he said, "But then we're spending on yesterday, not tomorrow," which I think is very appropriate in the context of the topic of the talk that was given to me, where we come from and where we go to. That journey from yesterday to tomorrow is a fundamentally important journey. And I think in the budget of the 22nd of February, for the first time in I don't know how many years, the budget is running a slight primary surplus, so we don't have to borrow to pay debt, to pay interest. Now that's quite a significant change. But I like to tease the left, because in fact it was Karl Marx who wrote about the fact that public debt is the only asset that ever is publicly owned equally by all citizens. And he talks about this wand that public debt has, that it takes lazy money and converts it into capital that should be invested in the economy. And that's what deficits tend to do. And you add interest to it. And that's the problem that we now have. And after a long period of accumulating debt with little to show for it, because you don't have a firm hand on the tiller ensuring, I mean, you can go and look at this in your own time, but I did reference the state-owned corporations. You've got to look back at this, and the state-owned corporations could only borrow against the strength of their own balance sheets up until the early 2000s, and they could only borrow with the express permission of the Treasury, so that there was a queuing system and we didn't meet each other in one of the financial capitals like Zurich or New York or London. There was, and that is the job of the Treasury. It has to manage its process, and unfortunately it was weakened, and hopefully Minister Godongwana and the team will reassert that responsibility to manage debt and then manage it down from this position of the first primary surplus in many years. The second issue is the public sector wage bill, which is a rather uncomfortable issue, as you point out, Prof Parsons. It's uncomfortable because you've got to announce a budget. You can't negotiate with public sector unions, give them an advantage over the rest of society, because you've negotiated with them and say, well, we first negotiated with Public Sector Bargaining Council. Now we can see what's left for education or healthcare or road construction or whatever. And so the finance ministry is left with a choice where it makes a call. The interesting issue is that it might be perhaps in the business school or somewhere in NWU, there might be detailed analysis of what the public sector, what a public servant actually earns and what the increase cycle is, because there's talk now of increasing, there was the 3.5% last week that people were talking about, and increasing that. But if you build in all of the other increases that happen as a matter of course, as people move through grades every year and so on, I think the average salary adjustment in the public service is probably still in the order of 11%. But the only bit of it that is negotiated is that which the Public Sector Wage Bargaining Council will settle. So perhaps a bit of transparency, a bit of sunlight on how the system works might be to the advantage of all South Africans. There might be resistance to the idea of public discussion about these matters, but it might actually be in our interest because it might just calm the waters as it needs to do so that we can go forward. I think and then if you've done that, there are a series of other issues. Productivity in the public service is a major problem. I had an issue recently, a terrible issue, and I'm admitting to it. I couldn't get a basic administrative function done. Basic. And I called a minister and I said, "Can you help me?" And his words to me were, "I don't know why we appoint such lazy public servants. It's just laziness." Because I tried by all means. I can't tell you how many phone calls I made and couldn't get through. And I know I speak for everybody on this call because we all have the same experience. Unless we change those kinds of things, unless people understand that, you know, they don't do us a favor by being employed, we're not going to fix this thing. It's the capacity of issues and the performance of the public service generally that we need to pay attention to as part of the discourse around wages. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Piet, I see that you are hopping around on your chair. Can't wait for.
I'm nervous.
Piet, are there questions that you'd like to relay? I see there's a lot of questions and comments made in the chat room.
Yes, there are, but if you'll forgive me, there's one that I'm burning to ask Mr. Manuel, and it's something a little bit more political and perhaps to do with our recent experiences, and that a question that we get a lot from risk analysis anywhere in the world, the people that are investing in South Africa is, given the close relationship, and I see Anthony Blinken says that he's got great understanding for the close relationship between the ANC and Russia. And I think even President Biden has got enormous sympathy for the liberation struggle. So in that context, but we still hear the question, what are the chances that South Africa will end up in a situation that they may attract sanctions, international sanctions, because of certain policy positions? We know by July, later this year, we will have the BRICS meeting in South Africa, and it's very likely that President Vladimir Putin will visit South Africa, and it will be in contravention to our International Court of Justice arrangements and the Rome Protocol. What are the chances that the ANC still has the sensibility that we simply, given our circumstances, low growth, high inflation, all those figures that you've mentioned, what are the chances that the ANC and the government still has that sensibility that we really can't afford international sanctions against South Africa due to transgressing some of the international laws, enforced, if you wish, by the Americans to a large degree, but which, unless you're in compliance, you might attract sanctions?
It's a very important question because the difference between mathematics and politics is, in mathematics you sometimes get absolute answers. In politics there are no absolutes. And the interesting question is that within Washington, D.C., in the Congress, there's a campaign to remove South Africa's preferences under the Africa Growth and Opportunities Act, AGOA. Now, AGOA started out dealing primarily with clothing and textiles. It grew to other manufactured goods. It includes the auto sector and auto components at this stage. Now, if you do the math, as the Americans would say, and you are so insistent on having joint military exercises with the Russian Navy, well, we don't have a Navy. It's good to know who's got a Navy, but if you insist on doing that and you do it at the cost of manufacturing in South Africa, where jobs are so hard to come by, that is the circle you've got to square, and you've got to be able to explain that to South Africans. In these kinds of decisions, there are balances. I mean, in the same way as they say there are no permanent enemies or permanent friends in international politics, in the same way, when it comes down to where the rubber hits the road, you must be able to explain these kinds of decisions. Now, you can take this thing off on a different trajectory and to ask, because it's a very interesting one, whether Vladimir Putin or Volodymyr Zelensky comes from the Soviet Union. Because there's an idea that Russia represents the Soviet Union. But if you read Putin, then you should not be surprised to discover that he is a Tsarist Russian who wants to reclaim the territory of the Russian Tsar, and that's why he will lean over into what was parts of the Soviet Union. And so that kind of expansionism is very worrying. The key issue is what will provide peace and what role do we play? Then you've got to string out a number of other issues. You've got to string out our role in BRICS, and you've got to ask what it provides for us. You know, it's a complex issue. But I do hope that within government, the DIRCO, the National Security Council, a number of agencies in government, they're actually doing these kinds of balance of forces appraisals so that they can try and assist us as a nation in determining how to take these things forward. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Yeah, indeed, we in the business school has to focus on the future. We are training, hopefully, the future leaders of the country who will have integrity and insight and hope. And Dr. Joseph, I know you're very passionate about it. Do you have questions for the Mr. Manuel?
Maybe one loaded one, and thank you, Mr. Manuel, for honoring the invite. I think one of the things that we accept as South Africans is that we are resilient. And over time, we've seen when we had the problem of crime, we started personal security. You put an electric fence, you get a security company. For health, the private sector is flourishing at the back of a government that's not able to provide health services. Similarly, in other areas of education, we're seeing private schooling growing. And all this alludes to the possibility that the public has lost trust in the political leadership. And given where we are at and where we need to go, I mean, there's limited opportunity to grow the economy, limited funding opportunities for us to really do anything. What can we really do to restore public trust in the leadership space?
That's a fundamentally important question, Prof. Sekhampu. One of the points that I raised is that it has to start with the ability of government to provide leadership to all. And there are parts of that discourse that are voluntarily given, and there are parts that are grudgingly given, but it is a necessary part. It's the construction of society. I mean, what else gives us our identity as South Africans? We're a complex nation. It's not just that we occupy this geographic space at the foot of Africa. We speak 11 different languages. We have different persuasions. We have different religions. There is nothing, you know. In some parts of the world, they can say, well, I mean, I remember the Greek right wing saying, if you're not a member of the Greek Orthodox Church, then you can't be Greek. You know, in some places you can take that kind of view. We are heterogeneous in every aspect. And so the one thing that we have to look for is the ability of this government and the state to bind us together into common purpose. We can't rely on the Springboks and the Proteas to do it for the state. We actually need government to be focused, to be talking, to be engaging with us, to be listening to us, and that becomes quite important, you know. And part of that discussion means that evidence becomes important. I go back, and I don't want to sound too precious about the National Development Plan, because I mean, I agree with everything you said. And the problem that we have in South Africa is what the classicists may describe as entrenching classism. Because if you can afford it, you opt out of the system. You live in a gated community with private security. You send your children to a private school, you have access to private healthcare. Unfortunately, you still have to use public roads, but for the rest, you've opted out of public services. Now, there aren't many countries in the world where this is permitted to happen. And so everybody wants to get up the ladder so that they can afford all of these things, but there are real challenges. The one example you didn't mention, it's an important one in the current context, and that is how to deal with healthcare in South Africa. From what I read earlier, there's a debate on how to take forward the NHI in Parliament at the moment. And part of what Parliament had yesterday was that there were two pieces of legal advice. One via, I think she's called the Deputy State Law Advisor, and the other via Parliament's Chief Law Advisor. Now, I haven't read these two pieces of advice, so I don't know the content. But according to the articles I've read this morning, is that they are at odds with each other. So within government, broadly defined, there are two trains of advice at odds with each other. The key issue is how will you implement the NHI? Now, I said I don't want to sound too precious about the National Development Plan, but when we did the work on the NDP, and the work was done between 2010 and 2012, our approach to the NHI was to support, our approach to health was to broadly support an approach towards a state-funded health system. But, it's a very important but, we recognized in the chapter, and I think it's chapter 12, that the gap between private healthcare and public healthcare is just too great. And the rational thing to do is to invest in the upgrade of public healthcare facilities, to close the gap from there so that the choices become more rational. Now, near to me are a few public hospitals. Charlotte Matlake burnt down not so long ago. It hasn't been fully restored. It's not been able to get its oncology unit up and running, and it's very, very poorly administered. Last week, the Health Ombud released a report on Raymond Musa Mother and Child Hospital. It makes for horror reading. It looks like it comes out of some Charles Dickens novel. You can go to Helen Joseph, you're going to get the same thing. You can go to Barra. There are parts of Barra that are exceedingly well functioning and parts of Barra that are falling apart. And there are parts of the hospital system in Gauteng that they've not been able to get up and running again, like Edenvale Hospital and so on and so on. Now, where I live, if I need healthcare facilities, I've got a choice. I mentioned the hospitals that are near to me, but there are also a number of private healthcare, and there's a university-supported hospital not far from where I live. Where do you think I will go? And my instincts are not anti-NHI. I would just not want to place my own life in a system that is so malfunctioning. So I stand by the position that the only way to deliver an NHI, leave aside the legislation for now, the only way to deliver an NHI is to assiduously make the investment, maintain the quality of upgrades and maintenance, ensure that the staff are on call, available, ensure that the facilities are clean, close the gap between public and private, and then the country has a shot at an NHI. Until then, I'm afraid it's going to be a pipe dream. I think the same issues apply with many other parts. They are very, I mean, I do some work in education. There are some public schools in townships that function exceedingly well. Of course, there are also some very lousy ones. There are healthcare facilities in provinces where, pit latrines and mud schools have not been dealt with yet. But sometimes frequently that's not because of the teachers, but that's the administration of health in the provinces. We've got to call those issues out, I think, and then say that South Africans and South Africans who have no choice but to use public facilities deserve a hell of a lot better than the public services are providing for them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. We initially said we have an hour for this. Now with all these eloquent speakers, we've run out of time. And thank you so much to our panel members from the university, and then in particular, Mr. Manuel, thank you so much. It's a great honor to be able to listen to you. Thank you very much for the time you made available for this. It's really appreciated. And then to all our participants, especially our students, this opportunity is a showcase of the hope we have. South Africa has had some very interesting challenges in its history, but we've shown, and Mr. Manuel is an example of that we can get past those problems, that we can create a future for ourselves, and for that we wish to thank him, and that is hopefully the inspiring thing we would like you to get out of this session, towards building a future for all of us. This country belongs to its inhabitants, all of them, and not to if I may say, the politicians. They're part of the picture, but it is our country and our future. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.